So if the last panel drilled down on the concept of world, and as it turned out, a lot about immersion and extractability as well, now we're going to talk about character and character design in a transmedia world. And if we can start clicking through the slides here. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers briefly, and then we're going to go back through and I'm going to have each of them make a very brief opening comment. So here's our group. We go to the next one. So first up we have Geoffrey Long, who's a program manager for entertainment platforms at Microsoft. And I know Geoff as a former student who worked closely with us and as a researcher at the Comparative Media Studies program back at MIT. But he's also moved, and he continues to be a scholar, a writer, a critic, but he's also really trying to study transmedia very deeply through his new position at Microsoft. And I think we have another slide or two for some of the things that Geoff has been writing for, everything from the Gambit Games Lab at MIT to the Interstitial Arts group. So this is just a sample of the things that Geoff has been involved in. If we go to the next one. Here's Alisa Perren, who's an associate professor at the Department of Communication at Georgia State University, my alma mater. And I'm always a proud GSU Panther back in my distant past. And if we go to the next slide. And she co-edited with Jennifer Holt, who some of you know is up at UC Santa Barbara, this great book, Media Industries, History, Theory, and Methods, of which you'll note I have a piece. And definitely worth checking out. If we go to the next slide. And also has had a forthcoming book, Indie Inc., Miramax and the Transformation of Hollywood in the 1990s. All right, next up. And then she's coordinating editor in Media Res, which is if you don't know, is a really spectacular project which shares video clips each day with critical commentary from some of the top scholars in the field of media and film television studies. All right, Kelly Souders is, as you can see, worked her way up from writer to executive producer, working on Smallville, which has been one of those shows that has been an absolute watershed for thinking about transmedia and thinking about the intersection of television, especially with comics. And here's some images from Smallville. And there's some of the spectacular transmedia work that's been done around Smallville, taking advantage of any number of online formats, I think, to push the story and the story world in new directions. And here's some more of the stuff that's grown up around this long-standing franchise, which is about to close out its run after a good number of years. And here's Francesca Coppa, who's a scholar, an advocate, and a fan, and I know her most prominently as being one of the founders of Organization for Transformative Works, which is an organization by fans for fans that is trying to develop everything from has developed an online scholarly journal, has legal community supporting transformative works, and also developing its own tools and platforms to allow fans to control the exchange of the stories and media that they're producing. And she's doing some really great work. I worked with her on a production of explaining fan bidding, which is part of the New Media Literacies project that I've been part of. All right, so let's go back to the previous slide. Can we get up the picture of the panelist? Because what I want to do next is we're trying, as we continue to try to go beyond the top level of what is transmedia, to think about design questions. I ask each of the panelists to think about a particular moment or creative venture in the space of transmedia and to try to think through what are the design principles, what are the core ideas that shape the decision making in the development of a character in transmedia. And I'm just going to have them go down the row, and we've got a few slides Francesca contributed, which we'll get back to in a minute. So,
hey everybody. So as Henry said, I am in this remarkably fortunate position now to transition from the academic space into the industry space. And because of that liminal interstitial opportunity that I've got, I'm finally getting a chance to take the research that I did with Henry and at MIT and apply it into real, really interesting projects at Microsoft. So while I was working with Henry, I did my master's thesis looking at the Jim Henson Company. And part of that research was identifying this key aesthetic component of transmedia stories that seemed to work really, really well, which was this inclusion of negative space inside of the stories that then relied on what is known as the negative capability of the human imagination to fill in those spaces without kind of tumbling into those empty spots. And this is what you see in Star Wars. So in the original Star Wars trilogy, there's all these references to the Clone Wars, right? And when we saw those movies, some of us were younger than others, we kind of glossed over those parts because our imaginations were like, wow, that really worked. There's this whole like Clone Wars thing, but that's really interesting. So you just kept going, with the story, and your imagination filled in those gaps without, screeching you to a halt, while you wondered about it. You really saw this in characters like Boba Fett, right? Because the whole mystery of Boba Fett in the original Star Wars trilogy opened up the space for those of us on the playgrounds to debate over what was under Boba Fett's helmet. But then it gave Lucas the opportunity to come back years and years later to answer those questions with a remarkably profitable series of extensions to the franchise. So what I'm doing now is taking that and pushing it one step forward. So I've been building this kind of framework that I would run any new IP through to say, does this thing have the kind of opportunities built inside of it to build something ideally the size of Star Wars? I keep coming back to Star Wars because I'm a kid of the 80s and so much of this stuff is in my head from Star Wars. But talking about character design specifically, one of the greatest characters of transmedia in history is Darth Vader. So if you look at Vader, he personifies at least 3 different elements that are really key to his success as a transmedia character. The first is that he has a very, very recognizable silhouette. Okay? When I was back at MIT, I took this class with Frank Espinoza, who's the guy that does Raketo, right? And one of the things that he taught us in his world-building class was that if you look at these characters, you have very, very recognizable silhouettes. So Vader has that funny samurai helmet and then the straight lines of the cape. But then if you put that next to somebody like Bugs Bunny with the tall ears, or Mickey Mouse, most notably, or next to somebody like, say, Master Chief, shameless plug, what you start realizing is that even if you take away all the details, you still recognize that character as that character. What else does Vader have that's really important? Well, he has the voice, right? So even if it's just a radio drama, you still recognize Vader's deep, booming James Earl Jones voice, which they didn't nail with Anakin, but that's a different story. And then he has action. So if you're starting to have stories that move into video games, having identifiable actions are really, really important. So Vader has famously that kind of choke, right? The force choke. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. And so if you were, say, to be doing a video game, one of the things you'd be thinking about was, what does it feel like to be Vader, doing this, right? So these are the kinds of things that if you're thinking about character design, pushing past just one character into an entire franchise. Now, I came on too late to be working on the Halo Reach game, right? Do you guys know what I'm talking about, Halo Reach? Okay. You guys notice that one of the coolest things about Reach is that they took the character of Master Chief and made like a number of new characters that kind of were recognizable as variants on Master Chief, but were all different. It's those variations in the silhouette that make that character extensible across multiple franchise extensions. And so that, I think, is one of the coolest things I've seen lately.
Very good.
Hi, thanks for inviting me here. And I'm coming at this in a slightly different way. I was trying to think about transmedia properties that aren't genre fair, because it seems like a lot of the conversation has tended to focus on fantasy and science fiction properties. And so I was thinking about one of my favorite transmedia franchises, which is Law & Order. And it's not discussed as a transmedia franchise. And so my question is, and it is more I want to pose questions, what are the boundaries? And you might say, oh, Law & Order, it's just episodic. How many people watch Law & Order regularly in here? I'm curious. Okay, yay. But if you're a devoted fan who has obsessively watched every episode of every Law & Order, then you might know that one of the pleasures I take is seeing the parsing out very carefully and slowly of the characters, but not just in the shows and across the different shows. And I'm very intrigued because Law & Order LA is being rebooted by bringing one of the performers from the mothership to Law & Order LA to try to reboot it in a way that makes it work better than it did. But also that there are video games, a series of video games where you can play the characters. There have been books that are structured like the show, but add backstory to the characters. And so the question is, how in thinking about properties like Law & Order, or other properties that are not genre fair, can we expand how we think about transmedia, who the audience might be that is perhaps not being acknowledged as much, and how we might expand the conversation even more provocatively?
Well, I am coming at it with a completely different perspective than either of you, probably, which is I really kind of stumbled into transmedia very blindly. I started as a staff writer on Smallville 9 years ago, and at the time had no idea what online content was. And I think that our television show was one of the first, thanks to Mark Warshaw, who is the brains behind all the content online for Smallville. And so that was sort of like the beginning of my introduction to it. And thinking about it, I think that it's had probably two major impacts on the show. The first is really for publicity. I mean, we've just been able to reach characters and fans in a way that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. And I think it's probably best example of it is through something called the Chloe Chronicles that sort of focused on Chloe Sullivan, who is one of the loved characters on the show, but was not Clark Kent or Lois Lane or Lex Luthor, so she had never been introduced into comics before. Now, she is now actually just been introduced to the DC comic world, which is great. But she, having the Chloe Chronicles allowed people who loved her to really get to engage with her more. It was just Chloe who was sort of talking to the audience. They felt like they had this inside track into her world, and it created the most intense fan base I've ever seen. I would say you would think like a show about Superman, it would, our fan letters would be about Superman, and literally 9 out of 10 fan letters that I get are about Chloe Sullivan, who you just, outside of Smallville would never have heard her name. And so not only did it help the show, but it also helped Allison Mack, who plays Chloe Sullivan, and she was very smart and realized coming in to shoot an extra day every once in a while was going to give her own fan base, and she has capitalized on it. And then the second way that it's really impacted the show is through just having a creative world outside of the show that we can lean on. When you get to like 177th episode, 218th, and you're trying to figure out what the hell you're going to write about, it was always very beneficial for us to look at all the other media that Smallville and Superman has touched and draw from that. And about 3 years ago, when my partner Brian and I inherited the show, we also inherited a massively decreased budget. And one of the big issues going into that year, everybody assumed that the show was going to be canceled, and we just decided, let's take risks. We're not going to be able to give people the visual effects that they're used to seeing, the special effects. We can't build sets the way we could before. So what we decided to do was to go to the origins of the comics and return to the characters that there's already a fan base for. So we started bringing in all the DC big villains, Metallo, Doomsday, Zod, all these characters that we already knew people were plugged into because of the comics. And we lasted another 3 seasons, and I think that was a big part of it.
My name is Francesca Coppa. I'm Director of Film Studies, and I'm a Professor of English, both of which will be germane in a minute. But I'm really here because I'm one of the founders of the Organization for Transformative Works, which is an organization that fans founded, fans, myself and others, partly to kind of create a nonprofit. We're a nonprofit space online to host and advocate for fan works. And one of the reasons this became necessary is partly because fandom and the particular branch of fandom that I'm in has been making kind of transformative works, creative works around media properties, I would say for years, 30 years in one estimate, from Sherlock Holmes if you want to go back 100 years, right, from the Iliad if you want to go further. I don't know how far you want to go. But people have been making creative works in an amateur way for a really long time. And actually the new interest in transmedia has kind of caught fans in a kind of legal and cultural crossfire. The potential for being kind of co-opted by companies, or potentially people getting interested in ways that are hostile, feeling you don't represent the brand, right? Being hosted by secondary social networks who are then making money off of you, so your nonprofit activity becomes somebody else's profit in ways that could be legally or culturally problematic. Anyway, this was all part of the background for the formation of the OTW, the Organization for Transformative Works, and we put out a number of products, including we're building, we have actually the largest all-female open source coding project on the web, which we have a huge number of coders building something called the Archive of Our Own, which is a fan fiction archive that is literally being built with the features that fans want for hosting fan fiction, and eventually will be fan art and fan video that fans make and that are tagged and metadated and searchable. We have an online academic journal on fan cultures and fan works. We have a wiki called Fanlore, which allows fans to document their own experiences of being fans and making works. And so we host all of those programs, so that's sort of who we are. So I'm here sort of representing really what I think fans do, and particularly what fans do with characters, and what fans do with characters across medium. So I made some slides and was really going to try to organize fan responses, particularly in terms of character, in these sort of two broad categories of telling more or telling deeper. The telling more, this is David Tennant's Doctor Who in the Peanuts universe, right, with his typewriter, telling more. So here's on the top of the TARDIS, right, which is the doghouse. Do you see what the fan art has done, right? So we've moved Doctor Who into this other universe, a smash-up of Peanuts and Doctor Who, and I liked it also because it has the storytelling impulse kind of built into the art, right? That not only does the art itself represent a telling more, but we see the idea of characters themselves telling stories sort of built in. The telling deeper, this was an icon that I found in fandom that made me laugh. Oh, you know what fandom I mean. The one with the guy called Jack or John who goes around kicking ass about being cool and cynical and emotionally repressed. Jacks or Johns, right, that mainstream television gives us. And so a lot of what fans are interested in doing is coming up with backstories or complications for that character. We don't know anything about why they're cool and emotionally repressed, but we're kind of interested in creating that backstory. And so in the telling more, this is all fan art for the TV show Stargate Atlantis, which ran for 5 years. They're mostly based on the two central characters of John Shepard and Roddy McKay. It's one pilot, one scientist stir. Right? And there was something, I think, just sort of luckily about the looks of these two actors that they became very notable silhouettes. If there's a kind of tuft of black hair, it's John. If there's a kind of slanty mouth, I mean, you could literally do it on that kind of icon, right? And fans do. So we have them as mermen in fairy tales, in a 70s comic, chefs, at Trek as Master and Commander, in a NASCAR AU, and a steampunk, and the smallest tip of the iceberg, visually representing infinitely more worlds, that fans are happy to kind of take these characters that they see as iconic and keeping them who they are, moving them into all these different kinds of adventures, different kinds of platforms. The telling deeper, fans want to know more about characters' inner lives and often want to make their identities, and I'm going to put this word in parentheses, temporarily more specific. So these are the characters from Supernatural if they were black. That show changes a lot if the two characters who are demon-fighting brothers driving across country in a battered 70s car, if those characters are black, that show would run very different, with a black with a trunk full of weapons, I should add. That story looks very different, and fans have noted that. We have an MPreg, we have an MPreg Batman Superman. Male pregnancy is huge. This is like a huge part of female experience that is present in almost no major mainstream storytelling, and fans often, because we can do it, will create stories like that. The upper column here is Wonder Woman if she were actually Greek. Like, what if Wonder Woman were a feisty Greek chick? Like, what would that look like as opposed to, you know, a supermodel in high heels and a bathing suit. I think it's a really wonderful Wonder Woman. Here's Harry and Draco having a love-hate fest like we all know they were meant to do. This is a gender-swapped Holmes and Watson down here in this corner, as if they were blue stockings. I love the idea of Holmes and Watson as blue stockings, as if they were sort of 1890s suffragettes. What an interesting Holmes universe that would be. This is True Blood fan art depicting Eric Northman as a sort of tree and Sookie Stackhouse as the sun, that I think is saying something about their characters in light and darkness, and we have a gender reverse track. These are all really specific, different, personal, identified ways of thinking about these characters, and I think one of the things that is important to think about what fans do with characters is that we're happy to do it again and again and again. We don't need to have one. It's not even necessarily, I think it's really this idea of negative space. We don't need to have one particular backstory. In some ways, gaming is a really good metaphor. Like, we want to play again. I want to play Clark Kent and Lex Luthor again, but this time I want to play it with a whole new set of parameters. And I can keep playing the game of those characters a lot. I can play them as chefs. I can play them as mermaids. And my last, so my sort of ending point here is that fans have always just thought in transmedia, and for us to think about meaning that they transform mass media into text by writing fan fiction, and text, despite Vaughn's, there was a comment in the last panel saying that kids don't read, and maybe they don't, but they write a bleep load of fan fiction. And there's something that you can do with words that you can't do with other media in terms of giving interiority, backstory, an immersive experience, right, that is there. They transform mass media into art, into video, and into crafts. This is The Wire. Right, we all know The Wire is Dickensian. Up in the left, this is a stained glass mural of Smallville, and an icon that is sort of taking the famous Bob Dylan video and saying "viding," which is the process of making fan music video, is hard. Right, so these are examples of just the ways in which fans naturally are shifting mass media stories into various modes.
Part of what this continuum here is to suggest is that if characters are not being commercially produced as transmedia, they are becoming transmedia once they're fans in an age increasingly shaped by participatory culture. And so what we want, I hope that continuum comes across in our opening remarks. Before I even go to questions, I wanted to see if you guys had anything you wanted to pick up on what you've just
do
said.
actually.
Very good.
One of the things that I put in that framework that I'm working on is, ripping off of one of your origami unicorn revenge notions, is this concept of multiplicity. Because if you have the core components of a franchise that are significantly recognizable as such, right, then you have the room to reinterpret them over and over and over and over again. Hopefully he didn't bail out to go find a food truck. But he's been doing some amazing work looking at Transformers and looking at the multiple versions of Transformers that have existed over the years, right, in order to appeal to multiple audiences. So you see the same kinds of things that, if a franchise is done really well, will light up its head, can also lend itself to commercial viability for over and over and over again, which means that from a certain point of view, adopting kinds of things and paying attention to the kind of stuff that the Transformative Works and Cultures crew is talking about can be incredibly profitable over time.
And just, I don't think those things are in competition, and I think it's really important that they not be seen. That the idea of multiplicity, I mean, speaking in a certain way for fans always want more. There's not a way in which we're like, I've had enough Sherlock Holmes. I'm done with it. We'll take the next one. I'll take The Adventure of the blank. And I think that there's a tendency to sort of think that there's a competitive model when it comes to art, and that's just never been my experience. That people who want it. And in fact, you in your opening statement, I'm a child of the 70s who was a huge Star Wars fan. And part of the problem with Lucas's going back and filling in some of the holes that he made is fans had 30 years to invent some pretty interesting answers to that, and his answers were not that interesting. To his own, I mean, he made a lot of money, and everyone might be like, well, who cares? He made a lot of money. From a fanish point of view, right, nobody likes the following three films because almost all of the holes, which were the Clone Wars, I'm young enough to remember that Boba Fett was a serious contender for being like one of Luke's sister or Luke's family. Like, it was who's Boba Fett, that he was a family member, and people had elaborate stories between Empire and Jedi. And then
But you see, but what you're putting your finger on is one of the core problems of this negative space, is if you leave too much time for everybody to create their own answers, you're never going to satisfy anybody, right? If we were in a horror movie right now, and there's a scratching at the door back there, right? Until that door opens up, it can be anything. And each one of your imaginations will fill in that answer with something that is the scariest to you in particular. Right? So if you're afraid of wolves, it's going to be a monster wolf outside of the door. And if you're afraid of spiders, it's going to be a killer spider. And if you're afraid of plumbers, it's going to be the plumber from hell outside that door, right? What you want to be able to do is open up those areas for interpretation, but then be able to, rule one of storytelling is always don't suck, right? So give them something that will transcend, will exceed even their own expectations. And of course that gets harder and harder and harder and harder over time.
Or don't open the door and let them play the door over, and let me play the werewolf. Just keep selling me the door, and I'll tell you what goes through it.
And the Dungeons and Dragons crew will tell you this is awesome.
So Kelly, you must have been playing this game a lot, taking all of those DC characters and bringing them into Smallville, where you had very well-defined expectations over, in some cases, 50 years of comic books. Describe a little bit of those negotiations.
Well, what was interesting is we worked very closely with DC, and I think, to be honest, at the beginning of the show, there were a lot more rules about what the show could do, as far as I remember rules about, and it wasn't necessarily DC, we couldn't have Lex Luthor and Lois Lane in the same scene. And it's like, well, they're two of our main characters, and but that was people were very nervous, and I think over time people started to realize that the show Smallville could live in its own world, and as long as it just sort of dovetailed in, so that people who were fans of all different platforms were satisfied that there was one world out there, they kind of were forgiving. And I think that one of the other things is the reality is it's a TV show. We can't have people flying off to Mars. We can't create what you could do in the comics. So we had to create our own sort of rules. And sort of what happened was we took a character and we made it the Smallville version of it, which is what it's coined as. And I think. One of the things that I find a little bit difficult is that even though you have to have a global view of all the different platforms that you're working on in Transmedia, if you don't sort of look at each of them as their own separate entity and realize that you're telling a story and you're going to have fans that are just sort of in that one world and that you need to satisfy them, and you simply are looking at the global, oh, well, I got to have this line up with that, I think that you're going to fail in a weird way. I think that you got to have sort of both things going on, and I think, oddly, it's most important to tell the one story that you're telling at that moment, and then step back and figure out how to make it all a little bit more cohesive.
So could you describe a little bit one of those characters that you brought over and how you decided what made a Smallville version of that character?
Well, and there'll be a lot of argument as to the success of this, but probably the most... the one that pops out of my head is Doomsday. We knew, to be honest, I think that we created a character that had very specific look to it, and we knew that trying to make that at the end of the day in real life was going to be really difficult. So putting the ending of that story aside, what we tried to do at the beginning of it was make a character that you cared about. And that's something that Smallville's always done. It's like your villains are only as interesting as they are good, and your heroes are only as interesting as they are bad on some level. So that's something that we did, and we talked. We got all the approvals. We've done that kind of across the board. We did it with Zod, who was. We brought in last year and worked with DC, and we said, well, we want to make sort of the human, we want to see him before he became General Zod, before he became the character that everybody knows from, in particular the movies. I'd say he's, most well known from that. And they were very lenient about it, and it kind of allowed us to sort of explore him in a way that he hadn't been explored before.
I'm kind of actually surprised that you got so much pushback, because you're not the originator of the property, right? So, you would think already by the time you get to Smallville, it would be understood that there was the 50s Smallville, there was, that there's been 5 iterations. I really think, my first background is in theater. The idea that every generation has its Hamlet, that every generation could have its Superman, and that there would not be the same kind of pressure to make it line up. I'm really surprised.
I think the thing is, when you're dealing with Transmedia, though, you have hardcore fans for each aspect of it. So I think that we did. Believe me, we've heard earful from people who, are hardcore fans of a certain character and they've followed them for, decades, literally. And then you show up and they have their certain expectations. Now, hopefully what we try to do is win them over time. And, there's like I remember when we introduced Tombstone, the boards were going crazy before we aired, and they were like, I can't believe they're going to bring in this character. This is so stupid. We were literally in our offices going, oh God, what did we do? We just call the agents, we need to find a job. Like, we figured that was it. And then I remember after the introduction of him in the first episode going on the boards, and people were like, oh my God, this was totally unexpected, and I got kind of caught up in this character, and now I'm actually rooting for this character, and I can't wait to see how it turned out. So I think there's you get that initial pushback, and as long as you can give them a character with some depth that they weren't expecting, and they feel like they got to learn something new, but they still have the hopes that it's going to line up down the road, then so far, so good. Fingers crossed. We still have a few episodes to air.
So Alisa, with your Law and Order example, you're sort of pushing us in a just slightly different direction. How do we generate new characters who belong in a world, in a set of relationships? How does Law and Order become Law and Order Los Angeles or Law and Order Las Vegas?
Right. And it's interesting to think about, because I think part of it is the characters and the casting and the baggage that some of the characters some of the actors that they cast as characters in Law and Order LA, and the response that people had to that factored in. But I think it also meshes with the aesthetic. I don't know how many people have even watched Law and Order LA, but they chose a lighter look, and they got rid of some of the signatures of the format in the process. And so it was sort of the whole process with that particular franchise that I think led to some pushback from people. But it is interesting to see how, if you talk to Law and Order fans, people have different phases, different phases of the show, or different formats that they enjoy of the show. So the Jesse Martin fans, or you left when Serena came on, or that sort of thing. And I think a lot of it might have to do with the actors, but I can't speak for other people on that front.
One of the overarching questions that I'd sort of set out for the panelists is, does it matter that James Bond originated in a book, that Spider-Man originates in comics, that Luke Skywalker originates on the screen, or that Homer Simpson originates on television? They appear across a range of different media platforms. Has the push to transmedia changed the ways we start to conceptualize what characters are?
I think, yeah. Because anytime you want to tell a story in a medium, I mean, consciously or unconsciously, one of the things you start to do is you start to think, well, what can I do in this medium? What does this medium afford me to do, right? And so that's one of the reasons why superheroes show up so much in comics, and why certain things or certain aspects of those characters evolved in certain media. Refresh my memory, because it's been a long time. Where did the Superman's journalist history come from? Which were the media incarnations?
All right, so if we go, my memory is if we go back to Superman, that much of the journalism stuff actually comes out of the film serials. Stories that Simon & Schuster created, but the serial actually fleshed that out, because there was already an existing structure in movie serials to support reporter stories, newspaper stories. That the radio really fleshed out the Krypton and the destruction of Krypton, and really began to flesh that out, because there was a strong tradition of radio stories like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers that could dig you deeper into the backstory of planets. And it was a lot cheaper on radio to destroy a world than it would be on the big screen or the small screen.
Right. And it's that kind of thinking about designing a story specifically for the medium, that kind of narrative design, that I think you see it a lot in video games. So for Halo, for example, Master Chief is really a cipher for anybody. I mean, one of the things you'll notice about Master Chief is you don't really see under the helmet, partly because you want to imagine that yourself to be that person. But what's important about Master Chief is what he can do, the actions that he does, because that's the core affordance of video games. Which is why I think that moving forward, as we start planning for transmedia from the get-go, you're going to see more of that mix, like Vader, like I talked about in the beginning, of thinking specifically about, okay, this is the strategy I'm going to have to reveal additional layers of this character over time across multiple media. But one of the problems with that, and this gets back to the Smallville challenge, is that because there are multiple versions of these franchises, these multiple sub-franchises underneath the greater Superman franchise, being able to keep those instances straight so that if you had Smallville as a Transmedia franchise and then Lois and Clark as a Transmedia franchise, figuring out what it was about that original version, it becomes recognizable across all of them. And if that origin becomes the point of emphasis. Because in all of the Halo stuff, and again, I need to point out that all this was done before I got there. The guys at Bungie and 343 are doing remarkable jobs. Not me. I'm new. It's still that core of shooting is at the core of almost every single aspect of the franchise, because that core action is so the character.
I think just to jump on that just a second, one of the words that comes up continually in our office is homage. And part of it's when you want to BS your way out of a conversation and you're just saying, oh yeah, we're going to make an homage to that. But truly there is a big part of our job that is responsible for taking in, keeping some sort of respectability about something that's come for so long before us. So I think that we always end up going back to the comics and the films. For some reason, those are the two that we just really look at, and I think probably because they're the most popular. We try, oddly, to stay away from looking at Lois and Clark, the other television shows in a strange way, because we're in the same format. I don't know why, but it just feels very odd to sort of look at those. So I just mean, as writers, as we are coming up with ideas, we were constantly looking at well, how do we kind of bring in aspects for those fans that were watching those and make it sort of moments, key moments, you'll watch and you'll see images, and we've literally tried to mirror comic book panels, or we've literally tried to mirror an image. This year we did a Clark and Lois flight that was almost, as identical as we could do anyway, to one of the movies. So I don't know.
Well, because what you're trying to do is to hit two audiences simultaneously, right? I mean, you're trying to broaden to the new one, but also to reinvent and re-engage the old one.
See, I'm not at all surprised, and it has to do with what you're saying, which is I often feel that people are not working fully in the medium that they're in. And I think the last panel was really talking about this, that you really want to take full advantage of what these various media offer. So it makes sense to me that you wouldn't look at the other TV series, because in some ways they're working in the same color palette and therefore are in the same, they have the same parameters and restrictions. So they're not going to be hugely inspirational for you to think about translating. I mean, the trans part of it, about thinking what part of this can I adapt? Because I think if you try to replicate, you'll be television is always sort of the failed small screen if it's about size or scope or budget in a particular way. But television has intimacy and ongoing seriality and the ability to, that feeling of I see them week after week. I mean, that kind of companionship that you don't get in a 2-hour movie. And again, I know Henry's also an English PhD underneath all his disguises. I'm an English PhD. The text can do things that people don't recognize, and one of the reasons that I think many books fail is that they're trying to present the same kind of story, but in text, without giving you any of the kinds of things, the experience that text can give you as a ride or as an immersion, or they're writing a very exterior version of characters, right? That you might as well then go and see the movie because you haven't learned anything different about them. So I think that aspect of translating a character and thinking what kinds of things can I do with this character in this medium that are impossible, in other media, and to try to build then stories for that character. And I think fans do that pretty well. I mean, that they often will try to come up with, the art, video, music video, for instance, I think is a really important part of this. Fans make fan music video. And you might say, well, why would you do that? And the answer is, when you add music to image, you create a kind of poetry. You add emotion, you add feeling, right? Television and film are pretty exterior. You don't often get the same kind of values that you get in music of, say, soliloquy or song, right? Or the Shakespearean soliloquy where somebody suddenly opens up, or the song in a musical where the action stops and your feelings come out. But in a music video, you can kind of do a song that's like the song of Lex's heart. And you might say, well, somebody may not want to see that, but it is definitely there's meaning that you can get out of that form that you couldn't do in television, or you couldn't do. So to think in that specific way, I think, is really important for whatever medium you're designing in.
In terms of tailoring to the medium, one of the things I was thinking about that I'm enjoying seeing recently are, especially with comedies on television, the characters appearing on Twitter and developing their different personalities and personas. Community, I think, does a really good job at that. Parks and Rec also, with if you follow Ron Swanson on Twitter. With getting in a very limited 140 characters, being able to capture the essence of who that character is. And then, of course, seeing fans, I'm fascinated in watching the evolution of Tumblr and seeing how people are using Tumblr, for example, to keep the Ron Swanson story going. Ron Swanson, cats that look like Ron Swanson is a fan-generated. If anyone watches Parks and Rec in here, then you know what I'm talking about. But as a way to think about how you can scroll down on pages and continue to pay tribute to or expand on your understanding of that character on a particular form.
Also to jump in, just to answer your original question, because I work half as a producer and half as a writer. And as a producer, I would say, yes, I would think about character as far as like transmedia and how is this going to relate to multiple platforms. As a writer, I don't. Oddly, as a writer, I simply am like engaged in my story, and the fact that there's other platforms out there where I can delve deeper into the psychology of my character, it's almost just like I get an extra day with them. But as far as like what I'm focused on, just as the writer, I tend not to think about anything other than that, the story that we're telling in that exact moment on that exact platform. Truly, there is a big part of our job that is responsible for taking in, keeping some sort of respectability about something that's come for so long before us. So I think that we always end up going back to the comics and the films. For some reason, those are the two that we just really look at, and I think probably because they're the most popular. We try, oddly, to stay away from looking at Lois and Clark, the other television shows in a strange way, because we're in the same format. I don't know why, but it just feels very odd to like sort of look at those. So I just mean, as writers, as we are coming up with ideas, we were constantly looking at like, well, how do we kind of bring in aspects for those fans that were watching those and make it sort of moments, like key moments, like you'll watch and you'll see images, and we've literally tried to mirror comic book panels, or we've literally tried to mirror an image. This year we did a Clark and Lois flight that was almost, as identical as we could do anyway to one of the movies. So, I don't know.
Well, because what you're trying to do is to hit two audiences simultaneously, right? I mean, you're trying to broaden
Right.
to the new one, but also to reinvent and re-engage the old one.
See, I'm not at all surprised, and it has to do with what you're saying, which is I often feel that people are not working fully in the medium that they're in. And I think the last panel was really talking about this, that you really want to take full advantage of what these various media offer. So it makes sense to me that you wouldn't look at the other TV series, because in some ways they're working in the same color palette and therefore are in the same, they have the same parameters and restrictions. So they're not going to be hugely inspirational for you to think about translating. I mean, the trans part of it, about thinking like, what part of this can I adapt? Because I think if you try to replicate, you'll be television is always sort of the failed small screen if it's about size or scope or budget in a particular way. But television has intimacy and ongoing seriality and the ability to, that feeling of like I see them week after week. I mean, that kind of companionship that you don't get in a 2-hour movie. And again, I know Henry's also an English PhD underneath all his disguises. I'm an English PhD. The text can do things that people don't recognize, and one of the reasons that I think many books fail is that they're trying to present the same kind of story, but in text, without giving you any of the kinds of things, the experience that text can give you as a ride or as an immersion, or they're writing a very exterior version of characters, right? That you might as well then go and see the movie because you haven't learned anything different about them. So I think that aspect of translating a character and thinking like, what kinds of things can I do with this character in this medium that are impossible, in other media, and to try to build then stories for that character. And I think fans do that pretty well. I mean, that they often will try to come up with. The art, video, music video, for instance, I think is a really important part of this, fans make fan music video. And you might say, well, why would you do that? And the answer is, when you add music to image, you create a kind of poetry. You add emotion, you add feeling, right? Television and film are pretty exterior. You don't often get the same kind of values that you get in music of, say, soliloquy or song, right? Or the Shakespearean soliloquy where somebody suddenly opens up, or the song in a musical where the action stops and your feelings come out. But in a music video, you can kind of do a song that's like the song of Lex's heart. And you might say, well, I don't, somebody may not want to see that, but it is definitely there's meaning that you can get out of that form that you couldn't do in television, or you couldn't do. So to think in that specific way, I think, is really important for whatever medium you're designing in.
In terms of tailoring to the medium, one of the things I was thinking about that I'm enjoying seeing recently are, especially with comedies on television, the characters appearing on Twitter and developing their different personalities and personas. Community, I think, does a really good job at that. Parks and Rec also, with if you follow Ron Swanson on Twitter. With getting in a very limited 140 characters, being able to capture the essence of who that character is. And then, of course, seeing fans, I'm fascinated in watching the evolution of Tumblr and seeing how people are using Tumblr, for example, to keep the Ron Swanson story going. Ron Swanson, cats that look like Ron Swanson is a fan-generated. If anyone watches Parks and Rec in here, then you know what I'm talking about. But as a way to think about how you can scroll down on pages and continue to pay tribute to or expand on your understanding of that character on a particular form.
Also, to jump in, just to answer your original question, because I work half as a producer and half as a writer. And as a producer, I would say, yes, I would think about character as far as like transmedia and how is this going to relate to multiple platforms. As a writer, I don't. Oddly, as a writer, I simply am like engaged in my story, and the fact that there's other platforms out there where I can delve deeper into the psychology of my character, it's almost just like I get an extra day with them. But as far as like what I'm focused on, just as the writer, I tend not to think about anything other than that, the story that we're telling in that exact moment on that exact platform.
Well, we've been referencing the affordances of media, so maybe let's think about television for a moment. What are the things television does well as a medium for conveying character? And as a first step, we're also thinking about where is transmedia pushing us beyond television to deal with characters. So,
one of the things I've been thinking about is a lot of the discussion about transmedia franchises it seemed to come around television series in the mid-2000s, right? Like Heroes, Lost, I'm trying to think, 24, those types of shows. Highly serialized. And it seems like as the economics of television have changed and subsequent serialized shows have not done as well, those have not been developed as much lately. And it seems like one of the interesting things, one of the reasons I posed Law and Order as something to think about as an alternative is how within the episodic format, which is predominantly what Law and Order is, do you have certain allowances for character development that maybe could be exploited far more than they have been? I also think CSI is another example of that in terms of learning about the characters and moving them to new locations and giving them new, even backstories. I'd love to see The Good Wife, the early years, personally, in a movie, that sort of thing. And so that would be interesting to think about.
One of the interesting, I don't know how to put this, but there's this range of shows, right? Between the Monster of the Week, purely episodic kind of things, and then up through the shows where the phrase Monster of the Week came from, the X-Files, which starts to have those overarching plot arcs, story arcs, kind of like what you guys are doing with Smallville. But my favorite one lately has been Doctor Who. The most recent seasons of Doctor Who have had this remarkable balance of character development over still single episodes, because especially in television, I think that there's a real emphasis on the notion of modularity. If you look at transmedia franchise design, every single component of an ideal transmedia franchise is actually an ambassador, to a new audience, right? If you have a transmedia franchise that goes from television, then broadens out to comics and then goes to novels, yeah, you are leveraging those unique affordances of each medium to play off of those media, but what you're also doing is broadening the potential audience for that franchise to the native audiences for each of those media. Now, the trick is each one shouldn't feel like an advertisement for the rest, right? And it needs to feel additive. It's your additive comprehension, where the origami unicorn concept originally came from. If you have this notion of each particular piece is an ambassador for the rest, that is a hook for the rest, that is awesome in and of itself, then it can draw you into the rest of it and then build up those characters. So that even if I did watch the most recent episode and I never saw any of the rest of it, I still get sufficiently engaged to want to explore the rest, which is an awfully hard balance to strike.
To add to that, I mean, obviously, it's a chicken and the egg, but obviously many of the most popular transmedia franchises had a very early, almost accidental transmedia kind of split. So for instance, I think about Sherlock Holmes and the Deerstalker hat, which is nowhere mentioned in Arthur Conan Doyle, but was lucky enough to have illustrations of that mode that made him visual very early on, and then, from there to film and, the whole panoply of Holmes stuff. So that the idea of being able, and that you would not say, I mean, I guess you could say that the illustrations were secondary, but I think had a life, a vitality of their own, that they were genuinely a transmedia second medium that were rich enough to then provoke any number of others, right? And I think, to return back to the original question of television, I think we may be in a place right now where we're not really sure with television. I think I was just at Society for Cinema Media Studies, and I went to a panel that was talking about HBO's slogan of "It's not TV, it's HBO," meaning that there's something else happening with so much of this kind of acclaimed HBO television that maybe seems different than television. Again, being an English professor, there's some part of me that sort of sees HBO as working in the more traditionally British model of seriality, but with very clear story arc, where there's kinds of closure. And again, I think one of the things that's pleasant about a novel or about text is that you often do have that sense of closure where things land in that medium in ways that, frustratingly, they often don't in television, which can, again, be a plus, right? There's nothing like television to kind of keep you on the hook. But I do wonder a little bit if, and you mentioned the X-Files, if post-X-Files and post some of the very highly serialized works, there's a kind of disappointment. And very early on, there can be a feeling of like, they don't know where they're going. And that can hurt a franchise or a newer franchise, because there are only so many times that one can be fooled. So to take this back to Law & Order, Law & Order has done a really good job of presenting something that is complete and yet gives you the ability to have arcs and see character development, and to be able to think in those ways both economically and in terms of the potential for launching your story into multiple platforms. I mean, the British do have sequels. They do sequel arcs to their series, right? They just don't have this kind of ongoing single story that we prefer so much.
The difference between telenovelas and soap operas.
Maybe, right.
So one of the strengths of television as a medium for telling stories or for dealing with characters is that it's a long-form storytelling, right? The characters have the potential to grow and evolve over time. But one of the tension is the desire to hold on to a format where those characters have predictable relationships to each other. So with something like Smallville, it's on for almost a decade now. You must be really struggling with those two sides, wanting to grow the characters, wanting them to add new depth over time, and wanting to hold on to the basic dynamic which allows the series to exist in the first place.
Yeah, and I think, when the shift happened 3 years ago, one of the other things that happened is the show it almost turned into a different show, which I think it kind of had to do, and it was a risk that we sat down and talked with Warner Brothers and said, look, right now you guys are already given you're assuming it's going to go down in a year, so let us just do something completely different, because they've already seen the stories that and I think in television the other thing that's interesting about it is that, and there's this rule, like the first 10 episodes are just the same episode over and over again to get the audience used to what the show is. And they you literally sit down and plot it that way. And then after that point, and it is about the mid-first season, you start opening it up. And I don't know why that seems to work, but it does in television. But certainly when you're on, as long as we are, now all the rules that we had at the beginning of the first few years of the series, none of them really apply anymore. We've just thrown it out. Who cares? Because now we have fans of the characters. And once you have fans of the characters, you can kind of do, take a lot more risks because people want to know about them. So as long as you can have a story that shows them something different about that character each week, that, fans are they're amazing. They will just stick with it and let you just sort of play.
I agree with that, and I would say I wish actually TV producers would be more adventurous than they are. I mean, I understand the idea of trying to imprint a kind of model on your audience, but readers of Henry's blog, I loved your recent post about relationships that never go anywhere in television, which is a huge. I mean, and there is to a certain level one can masochistically enjoy that, right? The frustration of desire is a wonderful thing, even the desire for closure. But I do think that it's become a kind of shibboleth of saying, well, no, nobody can ever get together ever under any circumstances, or it will kill all the tension in my show. I mean, if I've heard it, once, I've heard it 1,000 times. But the result is that you end up with these sort of bizarre people who look like no human beings on earth. And never mind that, clearly nobody who ever writes, I hope you're happily partnered or married. I mean, somebody must have positive relationships where one continues to work and fight monsters and or aliens or something and still actually be in a sexual relationship. Somebody, for more than 5 minutes. I mean, this was Henry's point as well, that the view of marriage is, infantile. It's not even adolescent, because I can understand the virtues of being adolescent, but it's actually, adolescents have longer relationships than people on television. And so that, I do think that that's something to think about when you're planning character, and that what could be revealed by moving through different phases of relationships with other characters, as opposed to assuming that they have to kind of stay in some sort of emotional ice block for what we hope will be your 9-year, your 10-year run, right? It can get weird.
Well, this is what makes the current season of Chuck so interesting, isn't it? Is that change from the guy and the girl, will they get together, won't they get together, to now they got together, will they stay together, and wow, this is actually working. But then what worked about that was they took the original formula of the odd couple and then shifted it like one character to the left, right? Which I think let them keep the core franchise characteristics of the show while still giving two characters that really rare happy ending on television. Well, relatively ending, hoping it's not ending.
Well, another affordance of television we might talk about is the reaction shot, right, which seems so crucial to how television creates characters. That is, and they often emerge at the intersection between the writer and the actor who are trying to shape this, and often imply a lot more about these characters than is ever explicitly said in the course of a show.
It's interesting, and I would throw the editor in there, too. One thing that we did on Smallville, and they did it from the beginning, was, most shows, like, you're just racing through plot, and you get to the end of the show, and then somebody throws out, oh, this was the lesson that I learned in, like, one sentence, because they just didn't have time to get in, give the characters moments. And one thing that Smallville did was we literally will cut lines left and right. We will cut plot points left and right to preserve the character moments so that you can see how something is impacting someone else emotionally. And I think that's part of why we really were able to create fans for the characters, is that people really felt like they got to know them, they got to know their reactions. And I'll just throw out this one story point, but I remember being in the editing room, and it was a scene between Chloe and Clark and Lana, and it was just a flat scene. Like, it was well written. I didn't write it, so I can say that. It was well written, and the actors did a great job of doing, delivering their lines, and it was directed, the shots were pretty, and we got into the editing room, and it just sucked. And literally, through editing, we created an entirely different scene through looks of Chloe looking at Clark, and we created a triangle, and we created jealousy, and we created a story that was never written, but once we got in there, we knew that something was missing. So I'd say that editing actually has a massive, like, as far as the visually, is as critical as the script and as critical as production.
And then these reaction shots are what fan vidders often build on in constructing the vids.
Sure, and also just the subtext of television, right, which is, people stand much closer together in television to get in shots than they would. And so you start thinking, why am I so close to you? What is between these people? And fans can do a lot with blocking and other, right? I mean, people do. I mean, I also, don't shove people against walls quite as much as people do on television. I'm really frustrated with you. I'm going to shove you up against this wall. But you start to think that there's something You know what I'm talking about. I mean, so you start to think there's something going on, and all of this can very easily kind of be moved into other areas. I mean, it's up to you. I do have vids. I could show one, but I don't. I didn't want to obviously take my whole 5 minutes with a 4-minute vid. That would be bad.
At some point, if you've got something
Close
to
with one
get up, I don't know how much technically challenging it would be, but other people, thoughts on this, the sort of nonverbal cues of character that television is able to bring?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of reaction shots, what's become very popular with reality TV, of course, that's so significant as well. And we haven't talked about reality TV and the development of character. But if you watch Top Chef, it was kind of the joke with the Blaze face, where he's frowning. But this sort of raises the question of character development beyond even the television show that is enabled especially by reality in interesting ways. And Top Chef, of course, where it becomes about wanting to go to that chef's restaurant or see them on tour and experience what you see represented on the show in interesting ways.
They also used interiority very interestingly. In other words, Top Chef or a lot of the reality shows are essentially bringing in this non-realist form of, say, the soliloquy with the talking to the camera, and in that way then moving transmedia onto blogs. And I don't know if they actually write their own blogs, but certainly the voices are not that difficult, to capture, and they're creating something in text that then at least gives some sense of behind or my feelings or what I was thinking at that moment. Following the rule of don't suck, I think a lot of the times, the people working on the various, if you're trying to do transmedia of one particular franchise at the moment, not everybody involved in it is equally talented, and I've often been disappointed with the kind of textual, say, behind the scenes, or, so-and-so's diary, which was, written by just somebody much stupider than me. I mean, I hate to be blunt about it, but in other words, often, it's like I'm a genius neuroscientist, and the blog was written by, somebody who does not sound like a genius, neuroscientist in any way. And so, but, you may not get a professional novelist to be writing, or a professional short story writer to be writing your behind-the-scenes letter from diary entry of kind of transmedia, content. So if the content's really balanced, I think you can. There's been a lot of sort of bad transmedia where there's a kind of attempt, and again, I think the reality shows are actually doing it very well in that sort of natural integration of the behind-the-scenes soliloquized persona voice with the external view, and other franchises are not moving among media so well.
Because it's that consistency, right, that's so important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, as transmedia franchises get bigger budgets in order to do these things, then we can have the same actors showing up in the extensions that sometimes you don't get originally. The Baby Vamp Jessica blog from True Blood, I think, is a great example of that kind of speaking to the camera format, when it was the character's performance of it that really made it work.
And having the actor, if it's a video blog, the actor's voice can cover for different writing teams. In text, it's harder, because the writing really has to be good if it's a text. I mean, if you want to move it into a text or a novelization or something like that, moving into that kind of a mode.
And to be honest, like even with an actor delivering it, I mean, we've gotten to the point literally where I'll pick up one word on a page and I'm like, ooh, Clark Kent never says that word. And every once in a while I'll be like, well, let's just try it, let's push it, it's like out of it. And if I do, I always get a call from Tom Welling, who plays Clark, and he's like, Kelly, do you think that we could just switch this one word? I'm just like, I knew it, I should have. So I think it is kind of important that if you want that consistency, that you have one person who's able to look over all the material.
So the soliloquy has been such a part of comics, but in a very different way. The monologuing in comics is very different from the confessional in reality television. So but have you ever imagined what it would be like to be able to do confessionals in a dramatic series? Is that ever conceivable, or is that...
We've written them. Never really make it on screen. I think, honestly, there's certain confine, I mean, when you're looking at television, it's difficult to have somebody go on for 5 minutes and be so compelling that you don't get up and, look in the refrigerator. And I think that's, like, you literally in television, you are fighting the refrigerator. And we actually have a term that we use called, it's a ham sandwich, which means you were able to keep somebody's attention, and it wasn't until they're in their refrigerator getting their ham sandwich that they go, what, wait, that didn't make sense. And so literally we decide whether or not a point is a ham sandwich point or it's a point that we need to go back and fix. So that's, we just fight food.
So several of you started down this path of thinking about then what does the web add to the notion of character on television? What can you do with characters on the web that you can't do necessarily in the course of a serial drama?
Well, I think it is that, the soliloquy. I mean, I think it is the fact that you are not having to get a different plot through, and you can just focus on one character with one story idea and really delve into it. And I think, for me anyway, I feel like it's a place where you really feel like that person's in your house, you're friends with them, much more so than when you're having to cut back between different scenes and you're having to deal with commercial breaks that are, cutting up the story that you're telling. So to me, it's just a very freeing place to work in.
I guess I don't know I'm not sure what you mean by the web. I mean, first of all, it first depends what part of the web do you mean? Meaning, obviously, web could be a place for interactivity, but that's complicated and hard. If you have, somebody tweeting, as you say, tweeting as a character or even an author. I mean, often fans will do this and create kind of interactive role play kinds of moments, which you can do textually or do in more complicated ways if you have the budget. I think about Michael Piller, who was a producer on Next Generation and then did the television version of The Dead Zone before he died of cancer. They had wonderful sort of The Dead Zone had a really wonderful kind of online site for fans where they offered you all the scripts. They gave you really close-up photographs of plot points that you didn't get to see, and sort of dropped so that if you really wanted to kind of follow particular stories, there was a whole apocalypse that was happening. It was complicated. But if you wanted to find out, you could go there and get to kind of engage this stuff, and it was genuinely kind of interesting stuff. I think he, possibly from his work on Trek, had a pretty good sense of what fans would like to have on a website that was also sort of respectful of them in terms of seeing them as kind of people who were creative and storytelling people. Obviously, then, True Blood's doing their little mini features, right? You can do kind of mini-sodes or sort of little kind of comedy moments or other kinds of moments that wouldn't fit out. So I think the web has all sorts of potential. But as you say, you can't suck, and you have to think about what each of these particular media is going to add. And I think giving people a space to play. I mean, on some level, listen to your fan base. What are they interested in doing with your characters? And often it may not be what you expect.
I think it's also a range of things. I mean, because there's what the web can do for us now, and then there's what the web will be doing for us very soon. If you think about what the web is doing for us now, it gives us the ability to do ARGs and to do webisodes and to do those kinds of experiences. But as we move towards the next generation of connectivity, and you start getting towards this notion of entertainment for the cloud, I mean, that's when you really start getting into this idea that the story world is abstracted from the medium in which it's delivered, right? So that any given component, like a television show or a comic or whatever, is actually just a window through which you look in order to understand this external world. Well, then if that external world is itself web-enabled, then you start to understand, just like an ARG, that it can react to based on what you're doing. And then you start getting into some of the things they were talking about in the last panel. I mean, there have already been some examples of experimentation in this notion of transmedia mechanics, right? So a story that changes based on what path you've taken through the Transmedia franchise. One of my favorites is Assassin's Creed. The Assassin's Creed 2 console game and the Assassin's Creed 2 PlayStation portable game, if you connected them to one another, then additional weapons and resources were unlocked in each one. And you see the same thing in the Fable games, right? And so there were the pub games that came out on Xbox Live Arcade before the release of Fable 2. If you played those pub games, then you generated additional resources that then would have made available to you when you originally started your game in Fable 2. Well, imagine that applied to stories. Right? And I like to talk about this as the notion of side quests in role-playing games, because if you're playing something like Final Fantasy, the core story can be pretty short if you don't take the time to do any of the side quests, the optional missions that are in the game. But if you do, then what happens is it's kind of like tesseracts in The Wrinkle of Time, right? There are these spaces that then suddenly straighten out, and the storyline becomes much, much longer. Well, if those options become unlocked and then slot themselves back into the core storyline, because the entire system upon which the thing exists is part of the internet. The whole thing is connected and is aware of yourself. Then you start understanding, wait a minute, now we start getting into some really interesting things that you can't do in analog media. And then when you push that forward a little bit more to say, okay, now we know what you yourself have done or what you yourself like, it starts getting incredibly interesting. So, I mean, that's where I'm getting excited about what the web can do that television can't do.
I mean, people can be, to take it to character again, people can be Tesseract. So I'm thinking about this thing with Chloe, right? In other words, one of the things that fans do and that the web is great for is allowing you to go into the background, bring the background to the foreground. Right? Fans are perpetually finding characters much more obscure than Chloe and kind of wanting to sort of open their worlds up and, create versions of the thing from their perspective, have radical perspective changes on the same material, which open up avenues of gameplay and thought, like in my second this sort of telling deeper, right, of being able to kind of go into corners of the story that, were often not deemed, I mean, this is my understanding, anyway, not deemed commercial for the aggregate main mass media audience, but that can certainly happen in the more customizable world of both the web and of video games, I think, which is much better at allowing people to kind of go off into the individual corners that they like best. But I kind of want to tie this idea of the people as Tesseract to sort of race, class, and identity issues also. I mean, I think this is a place where, fans are routinely kind of going and finding, the marginalized, I mean, Pete, oh, Pete, the best friend, the marginalized black best friend, and sort of finding out that, oh my goodness, he has a whole world, right? Or changing, as I say, race, class, and gender of even more primary characters, which I think are important, and to recognize that giving that kind of option, you might not be able to do it on your main, big budget thing, but the web does allow this kind of customizable-ness. A couple of days ago, there was something interesting happened across the blogosphere, which is to say, I haven't played this game. I haven't played Dragon Age 2, so I feel like I cannot speak to Dragon Age 2. But did anybody sort of see it was sort of reported under the rubric of the sort of the pain of the straight male gamer, and a guy who plays BioWare's Dragon Age 2 sort of wrote a kind of big post about how they were sort of neglecting their audience, the straight male gamer, because the characters had gotten sufficient. He says. It used to be that all the companion characters were pretty much aimed towards being interesting to the straight male gamer, but that's not the case anymore, and I think you're neglecting your core audience. And to give them credit, the people at BioWare smacked him down, like, really hard. Like, you're not the only person who is in the universe of this game, and the fact that there are characters that are clearly, gay characters, characters of different kinds, characters that might be more appealing, to female players of the game, and obviously women are growing a lot in gaming circles, right, is a good thing. And I think video game designers are really understanding this kind of customizability and recognizing that it doesn't all the characters don't have to look the same way to appeal to this core audience. But this, fellow clearly felt entitled enough to sort of say all the characters ought to be directly kind of forward-facing to me. And I think the web and transmedia can be a place where you can do that, where you can create more marginal identities or less, whatever the perception is of the socially mainstream identity, and allow people to play, in that way and from that, perspective.
But I'd back that up a little bit. I mean, that's not necessarily something of the web. That's just a notion of intertextuality. So one of the coolest things about the newest seasons of Doctor Who, again, big nerd, is the way that there's multiple sub-franchises, right? Because you have Doctor Who as the core all-ages franchise, and then you have Torchwood as the adult audience, and then you have the Sarah Jane Chronicles, targeted towards the younger audience. And what the BBC did was, in a very strategic fashion, they gave people an opportunity to age up, from one franchise into the other, and you can see the strategy based on which characters appear in which other shows. Although the Doctor appears in the kids' shows, he never appears in Torchwood. But characters from Torchwood might then appear down in Doctor Who, which means that as you start watching as a kid, this character called the Doctor shows up, and you say, wait, who is that? That's interesting. And then you follow the Doctor into his own core show, which you're probably already watching with your parents if you're watching the Sarah Jane Chronicles. And then Captain Jack, again, Jack, getting back to your original point, yeah.
Less repressed, though.
Less repressed, much less repressed. Then he shows up in Doctor Who, and then you follow him on into his own TV show. This is a great example of how to use intertextuality as a broadening franchise strategy, but it would be amazing to see that done across demographics, instead, social and racial demographics instead of just age demographics.
So Chloe was the anchor for moving Smallville into the digital domain.
I don't know if she was the anchor. I don't think it started. I mean, she kind of was the beginning of it really picking up and.
Fan's point of view, so
Yeah.
she was always helpful.
Because I think that was one of the things that people tapped into, because we were in the Superman world where there were crypto freaks and strange things happening, and we had to act, I mean, the core of the show, you know, Clark Kent and his parents just sort of sat around and talked about like people being able to, you know, throw somebody, you know, over to the Jensen's farm, you know, next door or whatever. Like, and we had to talk about it like it was normal, because it was normal conversation for them. However, most of us don't have that conversation, so she really did become the viewer's eye into a very bizarre world and made you kind of accept it. It helped, I think it helped fans kind of go along and go, okay, I'm on for this ride, because at least one person knows that this is kind of insane.
But to your credit, you kept her going, and you made her really a rich character instead of just, you know, a cipher. I mean, in the first Hellboy movie, there was that character that showed up that played pretty much the exact same role as the audience's lens through which to react. And then the second one, gone. I mean, just completely gone. Because there was no point. You know, that they were already caught up to speed. You guys took that function and turned it into something that was arguably one of the best parts of the show.
Well, I think that's the thing, though, is if you're looking for longevity, you kind of have to come up with creative ways to make characters more interesting and deeper so that people stay with them. Otherwise, people are just going to be falling left and right. And at the end of the day, you're certainly not going to be on for 10 seasons.
So as you develop these characters through the web, are there limits to how much of that information you can then draw back into the television series, given that a lot of people are watching the show and not reading the digital material?
Yeah, I think the way we look at the television show is trying to give, and I go back to, you know, homage again, but trying to pay homage to things that a fan might really love and pass on to and go, oh, I remember that from either the comics, or I remember that from the web, or, you know, from some, you know, other aspects of different platforms. But at the end of the day, I have to know that, you know, some 73-year-old grandmother who's tuning in for the first time with their grandkid is not going to be completely confused. So, I mean, we have to always, no matter what's going on, whether it's a recap, and that is something that we ended up doing in the later years so that we weren't sort of bound to, like, at the top of every show, sort of going back through with, well, as you remember last week when such and such happened, you know, it kind of did broaden up a little bit. But as far as the television is concerned, you know, we're making a product to sell for a big studio, and it is a business at the end of the day, and they need to be able to sell it to anyone who walks in off the street who'd be interested in buying it. I think that's one thing that we don't have to worry about as much in other platforms, you know, is that this isn't something that has quite the confines of you're working for one of the biggest companies in the country, and, you know, it allows you to take risks. So in the online material, we're able to talk about what was going on in the TV show, you know, very easily, but it doesn't quite flow the other way.
That's interesting, too, because that suggests that one of the functions that Transmedia could do is move across a range of expertise, right, where your most expensive product in some ways gives you the lowest barrier to entry, but for people who want to have a much more expert, and if you want to reward the expertise in its own in your own canon or in any other place, you can kind of reward those fans on the web, where there's much less barrier. You know, the 73-year-old grandmother probably isn't there.
She probably,
Or
not
maybe
if it's
she
my,
is. I don't know.
my mom.
So one of the challenges, I think, of contemporary, if we think about the issues of identification and diversity, is more and more contemporary shows have large ensemble cast of characters who have to then be managed in relationship to each other. And one of the things that Transmedia potentially offers us is the ability to allocate time more equitably between secondary. And I wonder if any of you have thought a bit about the challenges of managing multiple characters and how expanding the text might help with that. I know Law and Order would be a case where there are large numbers of characters, for example, that.
Right. Well, for a lot of the shows like Law and Order and CSI, they balance so carefully with all of the characters, how much they appear, it seems. But I was just thinking back to your discussion of expertise, and that's a tricky one, just to shift things for a second. Sure. In terms of comic books, because I think that's sort of a problem that comic books have gotten themselves into, like they were talking about in the last panel, that in some ways I would think the theory would be to make money to draw people back from Smallville to the comic books. But it seems like that sort of relationship of returning people to comics, at least if you look at the sales figures for them, doesn't seem to be happening. And so the question is, do comics have to, and I know a lot of that has to do with how much backstory there is in those and how much prior knowledge you need in a lot of the sort of canonical texts. Is there a point where comics can be opened up at this point in time to enable people to jump in easily if they aren't already part of that demographic and have grown up with them and that sort of thing? Have you seen with Smallville, for example, people going back at all to the comics and being I don't know if you even know that.
In my test, no. Well, actually, it's funny because they created a Smallville comic, and then that comic ended, and they're actually rebooting again. And I honestly don't know. I mean, I think, to be honest, the bulk of our fans are either, I remember when they did the test of the pilot, which they always do to audiences to find out what people think, half of the people were screaming, "It's about Superman," and the other half were literally saying, "This is not about Superman." Like literally, it was right down the middle. So half of our fan base, we've always looked at it, half of them are hardcore fans of comics, and the other half have zero connection to comics, and probably, possibly never will, and they're just simply fans of the show, starting out as like a teen drama. So I don't know. I would hope that it would have created some interest in comics, but like you said, the numbers, I'm not sure that they prove that.
But part of the problem with that is that any medium, again, has its own natives, right? I mean, so my mom's a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, but there's no way she's going into a comic shop in order to go look for those comics. She gets them through me. But if she didn't have me as her dealer, the beautiful thing now is that she could either get them through Amazon or, more ideally, download them directly through something like the iPad or digital download services. Because what I think is even more important with that, getting back to your points about what goes into making a comic, right? Is that even a print comic, I mean, comics are pretty cheap to produce and pretty quick to produce, but there's still the built-in time for actually getting the things produced, right? Actually getting them printed, put on paper, shipped to China and back, and so on and so forth. But if you went with web comics, man, if Empire Strikes Back came out now, and hash Boba Fett, started trending like crazy immediately after premiere night, I guarantee you that the market would be flooded with Boba Fett webcomics from Lucasfilm, just in order to capitalize on that opportunity. I think that's a remarkable advantage of things like the webcomics and iPads.
Well, and that's what's so striking to me is it seems like right now, the comics serve mainly people who already are deeply embedded in that world. And it seems with digital comics, that's a place where you can have a platform to bring other people into that world and become experts, especially in a world where we're living where, we have so many superhero movies coming out and superhero television shows. I'm just curious if we need Geoff Johns here to speak to that.
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe later.
He seems to have been lost in the vagaries of LA traffic, but we're working on seeing what's going to happen on that front.
And ask him later.
Yes, I hope.
If you think of a character like Hamlet, who is certainly a transmedia, Hamlet is many, there are so many, you get a flash of faces and names and films and worlds and universes that kind of, there is no one. And I think that multiplicity, and in fact I would argue that a multiplicity that actually encourages difference, that creates space and kind of pries open that universe for multiple interpretations. If you want to take it to books, the best books are the ones that have 27,000 works of interpretation about them because people can't quite agree about what they mean. If it's perfectly obvious what it means, you finish it and then you leave it in the hotel, right? That's the book you take, you read it, it's done, and you're over it. It's the books that people argue about and that have that space. So, that would be my artistic answer for it.
We did talk a little bit about how to leverage the affordances of each medium in order to do things you can't do in other media. But I think that ideally you can overcome What I said before about natives for each medium, in order to reward them for overcoming the transmedia resistance, for going into a medium that they're not comfortable with, like my mom trying to track down the Buffy the Vampire Slayer comics, I mean, you need to deliver a reward that's significant enough, kind of like what Henry talks about, the origami unicorn, that is that aha moment. You know, that we talk about this notion of additive comprehension, right? It's like getting to the very end of The Usual Suspects, or better yet, The Sixth Sense. You know, when you get to something that makes you suddenly understand everything else in the experience in a way that you hadn't before. That's the kind of thing that will really reward somebody to explore a medium that they're not comfortable with. And that, I think, is one of the opportunities that we've really got here.
Yeah, if I can take moderator's privilege to also answer your question, you know, if we think about this think of it as a creative, from an aesthetic point of view rather than an audience engagement point of view, I would start with the word Dickinsonian that we were used to refer to The Wire. What are we saying about Dickens is he's got a complex set of characters, each of whom are layered, who change over time and interface with each other within a complex system or world that we're engaged with. Dickens could do it within a single medium, right? But more and more, pop culture has been stripped down to bare bones, but the ability to add those layers back in is part of what's achieved by extending the story out into these other platforms. So it is very much about moving from a story to some key characters to a world is what's realizable, I think, when you go into the transmedia space. And I think that's the complexity that, for, say, character, if we were sticking to the theme of this story, if we go back to the earliest novels, which were clusters of letters and diaries and sometimes transcripts that were read in relation to each other, what we saw was a mixture of different media or modes of writing that gave us layered insights into these characters, because as we read them, we were not only reading the letter to see what someone revealed about themselves, but we also were looking at who the letter is addressed to for what it reveals about the relationship between those two people. And we're moving from the same characters seen externally and internally by mixing those modes of writing within one of those great early novels. And I think that's what transmedia allows us to do, is by shifting modes, we get deeper and deeper into individual characters because we see them from different points of view. From somewhere they're the central protagonist of a story, and somewhere a secondary character is suddenly the protagonist, and we're seeing the protagonist through the eyes of that secondary character. So I'd say there's enormous creative, artistic advantages of this form, quite apart from the economic imperatives which are pushing the media industry more and more to get there.
But it also reinforces the notion that the world itself is a character. You know, by letting you have those multiple viewpoints into the entire scope of that universe, getting back to the core franchise characteristics thing we were talking about before, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to keep those relatively consistent. The most recent Stargate show, Stargate Universe, made a very clear break from the previous aesthetics of the show. It did much less of the humor, had a much different palette, like what you were talking about. And I think much like Law and Order, it got punished for that. Because it was no longer rewarding something. So it does give you a deeper insight into it and different interpretations of it, but it still has to remain consistent.
I think when it was just a television show and people were sitting in their homes and they were watching, they were simply voyeurs. They were just getting a little glimpse into somebody else's world. I think now it's a completely different ballgame, and because fans are able to have some ownership in it, it's changed everything. I mean, one thing we keep talking about television shows or features or things that create transmedia because fans then begin to create their own content, and we keep talking about the flow going that way. The truth of the matter is the flow also goes the other way, and more than one time, I don't know if I should legally admit this, but we've looked at media that fans have made and thought, oh my God, that's such a brilliant idea, and we've become very inspired from their ideas and gone off and done, not duplicated it, but certainly taken that inspiration and it has gone back into the show, either change things that we were doing in the show. I will say, you know, like a lot of the fan fiction about Clawley fans, Chloe and Oliver, for those of you who don't know. Anyway, we talk about Clawley fans versus Clark fans, which is Chloe and Clark, and the different, you know, the different texts that we read. It does actually end up flowing the other way and impacting the original source material. So I think that ownership is what's kind of going to will keep media alive. I think without it, you know, if I'm 14 and I can watch a TV show and then I can write about it and then I can go make, you know, a video about it and then I can share ideas, I'm going to be much more interested in watching television if it just stayed in the sort of historical format that it was in, and I can go off and write, you know, tweet about something else or, you know, watch a video game and do all that with some other media. I think television would probably, you know, die a very quick death.
I want to say, I'm 41, and I would much rather, I mean, sometimes I joke, you know, fandom is the way, I watch television because of fandom. Fandom is how people sell television to me. I mean, I have watched shows that I would never have watched as like a grown woman sitting here in my whole life if fans had not been creating really brilliant art. And in fact, I want to go, I mean, I actually want to be even more sort of self-aggrandizing, saying fans have been doing this a long time and really well. And that's not to say that everything fans do. I mean, you know, 90% of everything is crap. But in an organized way, fans have been doing transmedia for a long time and really know how to do it. And I think when you talk about ownership, though, I think most fans don't want to own it. The metaphor I would use is like, it's a song, and I'd like to sing it. And what I don't want is somebody to tell me I'm singing it bad or singing it wrong because I'm singing it as opposed to, right? I think you have to see the art as a song. You know, if you're a songwriter, you gotta hope people are singing your song in the shower and on the car and doing the remix and the hip hop and doing it as a waltz. And if, you know, and if people are not singing your song, you don't have much of a song. So I'm a little bit surprised at the sort of desire of people to sort of say, hey, I mean, I do wonder sometimes, you know, I talk to my classes about this, I'm waiting to find out, you know, when the kind of gigantic intellectual property regime is gonna come and basically say that I don't have performance rights to sing in my shower. I feel like I'm not even kidding. I wish I were joking. I mean, they actually, you know, did debate on whether or not you needed performance rights if you were, quote unquote, broadcasting a song out your car radio.
In Brazil, they're already charging for your ringtones.
I'm
When
just
your
saying,
cell phone is playing, people are going to start charging for that.
they're
so
talking
get
about a
ready.
performance right on ringtones. I mean, I'm pretty enmeshed in that legal world. What's being discussed right now is lunacy, but it's certainly terrible for art. I mean, I'm primarily somebody who cares about art. And you have a song, let people sing, and let it be understood that you're not responsible for every, you know, to follow my metaphor to death, you're not responsible for every, you know, 8-year-old who sings your song in the amateur talent contest and that people are going to think that's responsible for your brand, which I think is the arguments that I hear from a lot of producers, which is, well, people are going to hear that 8-year-old singing it and not realize how good my song is. No, seriously, that they're going to see the bastardized sung version. And I think what you really need to do is say, hey, awesome, I made a song that people want to sing. Like, let them sing it.
So this is the point where I have to be absolutely clear that I am wearing my scholar hat and not the Microsoft hat. If you look at Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, you know, there were the additional schools, right? And there were all these references to the additional schools. I keep thinking that if they had adopted some kind of like a sandbox technique, you know, so that Rowling could have said, you know, look, go nuts, you know, tell the stories about these, you know, these other characters, but lay off with the Harry Snape / fiction. But these guys are okay. You go tell these stories, and then built something up that would support that. I always wonder what would have happened with that, and I desperately want to see that kind of thing happening, because I wonder if that kind of adoption of almost an intra-work Creative Commons section, right, would either go over really well or would tick people off because it would just amplify the stuff that they couldn't do.
You know, I'm coming for you on that. I'm coming for you on that / fiction. No, but, I'm coming for you in this way. Is that I don't think it's an either or. I think it would be wonderful if, obviously, if there were more. You're almost suggesting authorized sandboxes for going to play. I don't believe in ever telling anybody to lay off anything. Not only just from a freedom of speech or artistic point of view, but I'll give you a secondary point of view, which is this: very often, works that are successful because they're tapping into some Freudian subcultural subcurrent, and it may be that you if you're the creator, you may not explicitly want that strand excavated in your narrative, but I would say really strongly that I think these are not wrong readings, these are subterranean readings. And if you don't have them in your work doesn't have that complexity. I mean, there is always, I mean, it's not that it's literal, but there is always the sort of that seems weirdly incestuous there, or there's a relationship there that there's not being admitted, or there's a trauma there that this narrative is about without being about. And that's often what fans are doing, and I think, you know, I certainly would never want to see creators getting into the business of policing readings, particularly when I think they're not even incorrect. Even if they were completely readings, you wouldn't do it. But in point of fact, they are often subterranean readings that are in the richness, you know, of the text. You know, one of the vids I thought about coming to bring to show is a Klex or Clark Lex vid, right, to bad romance. I mean, there's no way you can't say that Clark Kent and Lex Luthor have not had something that you would call a bad romance for like 70 years. Murder, death, suicide, killing, you know, struggle and angst. It may not be the mainstream reading, but it's one that when you say it, everybody laughs because there's just nobody on earth that, I mean, these two characters are clearly kind of enmeshed and obsessed with each other in ways that are undeniable, if not exclusive, right? You can also do the Clark Lois, you know, they've been in an ongoing, I'm sure you could do a different reading there. But that's, again, what makes the work good.
And what's, just so they stop laughing, we actually think of it as the Clark Lex love story. Yeah. And we actually write scenes with that in mind, which is this is a big romance between these two people. It's not necessarily the most typical romance you're used to seeing, but I think some of those subterranean readings are not quite so sub.
I would also say, if I never saw the word bromance again, I mean, there's something positive about this kind of constant bromance the TV Guide is always telling me is there, which on the one hand is admitting some of this, and on the other hand, I think makes it seem like, but we're never going to do anything crazy like show that anybody's gay on TV, which I have a problem with. I mean, I think that on some level, one of these characters certainly must actually be gay just statistically. So I resent the idea that by bromance what we actually mean is everybody's really straight, but we understand. So, you know, but we'll get there, and I think this is just a kind of history of representation on television narrative that we don't have to get into.
Just to also jump in a little bit to your question as well, we did something this season because of how active our fans are, you know, creating webisodes, creating artwork, creating text. We actually this year decided to incorporate them in the show, and we put out a message and said we want you to tell us whether it's in character, whether it's you know, and talk about what Superman means to you. And we wanted that to become part of the show, and then we actually had an episode which we didn't get to push too much publicity-wise for totally different reasons, but we actually were able to incorporate it, and we had like a good, I think, about a minute of footage of fans and what the show means to them, what Superman means, what the mythology, what all the you know, what the whole, you know, taking the entire mythos of, you know, many decades and putting it, you know, on screen in front of people. And I don't think that would have ever occurred to us to do had we not had super, you know, I don't know what I'm saying, but like, you know, very active transmedia fans out there.
To that point, one of the longest-running transmedia franchises, again, is Doctor Who. And one of the reasons why it lasted as long as it did was because after the show lost its support, you know, to keep being produced as a TV show, the BBC actually created official channels for the novels and the comics and so on and so forth, for people to actually experiment with the thing, these low-cost media, until it generated sufficient attention. I forget what year it was, you know, to come back. But the interesting statistic there was that the people that were the new showrunners got their start creating those additional low-cost media. And so, I mean, say what you will about the BBC having a different economic model, being, you know, tax-supported over there, whether or not that would ever work here, I think it's an incredibly interesting business model and possibility.
But I'd say Doctor Who is also interesting in that they, you know, those of you who know, and they keep changing the lead actor, which I think also sort of shows that we don't need to have consistency, that once you've established something like the Doctor, we can play again, and we can play again. I mean, and the Doctor is always the Doctor, and yet there's a sense in which all that multiplicity does not hurt the franchise, but adds to it. Also, to add to my identity thing, there was some scandal. I mean, people were really hoping that you might have a black or female Doctor, which apparently is also impossible. There was a thing about Spider-Man. Some people were suggesting that as a guy who lives in Queens, Spider-Man could be cast black. Apparently, this is also impossible. But anyway, these are just things to kind of think about, and if they're not maybe at the mass media stage yet, they certainly could be in the transmedia stage and might get you different audiences. To say, too, I mean, those of you who follow other areas of remix, like something like the Grey album, right, with DJ Danger Mouse, who mixed Jay-Z's Black album and the Beatles' White album, one of the things that did was get, people who like Jay-Z, who really didn't know anything about the Beatles, listening to the Beatles, as well as, I mean, I have to say, Jay-Z was not huge on my list before, being the nice white girl I am. And there was a way in which that did, open you up to all sorts of audiences that are not discountable. And I think in the era of the long tail, aside from the ethics of discounting any audience, I think in the long tail media world, you're foolish to discount any audiences.
So thank you very much.